am here at Pine Lodge Cemetery, thought of as Shepparton Lawn Cemetery. It is about 16 kilometres from Shepparton, but before Shepparton Council claimed it for its own use, it was a small cemetery in its own right and opened in around 1914. In that time, it accumulated a bit over a dozen headstones. There are, from what I could work out, about 20 people buried here from that sort of time period before Shepparton took it over. But its fascinating story doesn't lie in its deep-seated past. In fact, the most interesting story I could tell you about Pine Lodge Cemetery happened in the early 90s. But I'll get into Rocky Area and his connections to the mafia a bit later on. Before that, I want to talk about a couple of the headstones that are actually here. So John Gwan, I think that's how it's pronounced, I have no idea, lived in the Pine Lodge area. For those who didn't know, Pine Lodge is actually a very, very small town, usually associated as being more of an area than a town. That is gradually being swallowed up by Shepparton, or Shep East. Nonetheless, John lived in the area up until 1914, when he sold his property, and his neighbours and everything were quite saddened by this. Almost 30 years later, he died at the age of 85 and was buried in this cemetery because that's where his connections lied. David Douglas died in Guildford Private Hospital. I have no idea where that is. At the age of 87. His only somewhat claim to fame is his son was associated with the Shepparton Butter Factory. Perhaps you've driven past it if you've been to Shepparton. This is Rocky Area, and he was buried here at Pine Lodge Cemetery for 7 years before his body was found. For those of you who are not familiar with the name, I should make it clear that many people still hoped, up until his body was found, that he had simply just ran away and had started a new life somewhere else. The news of his body shocked many. So how did he get here? To answer that, I need to tell you a bit more about him. He was a young man, only about 20 when he died. He liked fast cars, pretty girls, and a bit of bling, just like his best mates, Vincent Latoy and Danny Murtay. Vincent is currently in prison for destruction of property, blackmailing, and pretty much anything else you can think of that would be associated with the Shepparton Mafia. He's only been in prison for a couple of years now, and up until then remained a free man, even though many thought that he was the one that ended Rocky's life. But I digress. In 1989, Rocky, Vincent, and Danny were charged with a robbery in Bendigo, where the robbers took property, jewels, and money equating to between $500,000 and $700,000. That's back then. In today's standards, it's safe to say that's equivalent of a shit ton. It was suggested to Vincent by perhaps his lawyer that if Rocky just happened to go away, just happened to disappear, then there'd be nothing linking him to the robbery, and that he would get off. Shortly before the trial, in 1991, Rocky did disappear. His car was found at Benalla train station, a white Ford Falcon. His parents were worried after he didn't come home. They had put their house up as bond to ensure that Rocky would attend that trial, so they knew something was desperately wrong. Vincent didn't seem too worried at all when discussing this with the sergeant investigating Rocky's disappearance. Let's jump forward. It's 1998, and a man named Jim Parsons passed away and was to be buried above his wife in their shared plot at Pine Lodge Cemetery. The grave digger, using his backhoe, began to dig the hole when he hit something. It was very strange. He shouldn't have hit anything this early. He was only 60 centimeters down, perhaps not even. He hopped out, and that's when he saw something strange. Black plastic. Upon further inspection, he saw that there was a body in that plastic, and that's when the police were called in. Poor Rocky had been shot in the back, wrapped in black plastic and lime, and tossed in a shallow grave. Someone else's grave. Mrs. Parsons' grave, who had died and been buried around the same time as Rocky's disappearance. 15 years after his death, he was finally returned to his family, where they could bury him properly, in a different cemetery. No one was ever charged for Rocky's murder. In fact, there is still a financial reward for any information that leads to a conviction. Now, all fingers are pointed to Vincent, and even the coroner said if Vincent didn't do it, it's safe to say that he ordered Rocky's death. Now, I don't know if Vincent did it. Anyone could have, in theory. Those boys were seen as being up to no good. The police were already well aware of them before they performed the robbery, or allegedly performed the robbery at Bendigo. So, if for some reason you do have information about Rocky's murder, and you do want to come forward, then by all means, you definitely should. I do feel for Rocky, in the sense that I think he was just a dumb kid who was too silly to realise what he'd gotten himself into, and then it was too late. I'm not saying he's innocent. I mean, he was obviously there. He obviously committed the robbery. It still shouldn't have cost him his life. If you want to hear more about his story, check the links below. I'll have a listing of the podcast as well as several articles to do with Rocky and Vincent.